Okay, Tima, let's talk about your essay. Um, I think that you make a lot of really interesting points in this essay, and I think that you ultimately kind of come to a thesis near the end of it. But I'm not sure that you know what that is in the beginning of the essay. This is just the introduction is very, very broad, right? Um, your thesis is like comics are one way of trying to combat issues like racism by discussing them, showing them. They bring to light hard situations and make them more relevant, especially in the era that they came out in. So basically, all you're kind of saying is that like comic books can talk about social issues and they can kind of like bring them to light, right? But the question that the prompt is asking is like, how did they do that negatively? How did they do that positively? And I want you to explicitly answer that in your thesis, right? So like it sounds like you're mostly going to try to make a positive argument. So while comic books are guilty of X, they ultimately do Y really, really well, which helps them combat issues like racism by bringing these hard situations to light. So you're not really answering the question explicitly. You're just sort of like they can address the issue. And because that thesis is really broad, your introduction is also really broad. Like you don't really say anything here. You just kind of say, there are complex issues in the world. Um, Things in today's day and age are things like racism and social injustice. We need to talk about these things. This claim, like people never mean any harm, is just not true. There's plenty of people who mean harm and who do terrible things. So let's not be overly optimistic. But I would argue that there's the seed of something useful in this thesis and introduction. I would argue ultimately that you do, I think it's like here on the very final page of the essay, you say, the first step in the right direction is always going to be hard, no matter if it's flawed. But the comics have good merits because they get points across, no matter how well the point is executed. The main idea is that it really mattered or that they tried. Like I think that you're ultimately arguing in this essay that like there's lots of ways in which we can understand flaws, but like ultimately making an effort um, gets the um, gets the social issue in front of people, makes them think about the social issue critically, which is valuable. Those kinds of things, and I think that you're kind of getting somewhere. Um, your paragraphs have to start with main ideas. This is not a main idea, and it's pretty difficult to kind of follow what you're ultimately trying to get at here because you don't tell me what to look for. You don't tell me what that main idea is. I put, is the purpose of this paragraph just that comics can educate? I think that maybe you're just kind of starting broadly by being like, comics can deal with real social issues. We don't really think of them as being like a medium for that, but they do actually serve a purpose. So I put here like, so if that's the argument, like in what ways can comics usefully educate? How are they successful? That's the point here, right? What do they do well? So if this is kind of a real general paragraph in which you're just kind of introducing the idea that they can do this thing, this might be a place to kind of introduce some of those general ideas before you narrow down and begin to deal with them individually. When we go into the next body paragraph, same thing. There just isn't a main idea. Um, Lots of things in here that are just kind of confusing. Lots of passive sentences. Um, So I think that by the time like I got in here, I put, so you're saying that the comic usefully establishes the black experience. Please be explicit. I think most people would argue against that claim. But I think that what you're ultimately trying to suggest is like maybe she goes about it the wrong way, like putting on blackface, not a good idea for a variety of reasons. Um, she um, she betrays her own privilege. She uses stereotypes. There's a lot of things that are problematic, but I think that you're ultimately suggesting that like she tries to confront her own privilege by putting herself in these kind of uncomfortable situations, which is maybe suggesting to the reader that we should be doing those things too. And that's useful, right? So maybe that's your main idea. Maybe your main idea is like, while Lois Lane is a problematic comic, the way that she confronts her own privilege in order to try to understand people who are different from her better is a valuable example for us to follow or something like that, but we need a main idea. Um, and by the time we got to the end of this paragraph, but so are you saying that she becomes usefully aware of her own privilege? Be explicit about what you're ultimately suggesting here. Um, so here, by the time we get to the end of the paragraph, you say, looking at this comic from a broader perspective without picking out any single little detail, the point of the comic was clearly stated and it helped spread awareness. And I was like, okay, so is your purpose that like we have to kind of look at the big picture and spreading awareness by itself as a virtue or something like that? So we got to name those main ideas. This paragraph was weird because you return to the super broad point. Like I would even, I mean, this is kind of just like comics can teach lessons, which is kind of similar to what you tried to do in your first body paragraph. I would say probably take this whole paragraph out and move it to the very beginning of your essay. Um, this is a totally different topic, right? There are many types of racism, and sometimes it isn't so obvious. True. Like there's no transition, no main idea. What's next? What are we going to talk about next? Remember that when we're talking about literature, we're always going to talk about it in what we call the continuous present tense, right? Um, um, so when we're reading a text, it's almost as if it's like happening in front of us right then. Lots of kind of interesting things in here, but like lots of just kind of messiness, tons of run-ons, verb tense changes quite a bit. You're misspelling the author's name over and over. Because you don't have much of a main idea, you just kind of fall into summary in here. You just kind of start to tell the story. Remember that when you're using a quote, it's always author's last name and page number, but you got to spell it right. But in here, I put, so what are you suggesting is most valuable about what the comic presents? Where do you see this working? Like, I wasn't really clear ultimately on like what your ultimate overall point was here. Let's see, where are we? So like in here, I mean, I guess that question of purpose is a major one, right? Um, like you say comics weren't made for this purpose, but they absolutely were intended to teach us a lesson about how to be in the world. Um, I mean, ultimately here you just kind of keep saying like they did the best they can do, which I totally don't believe. But like, if that's the argument that you're going to make, is that like it kind of sounds like you're like throw them a bone, like it's really hard to talk about these things, and they're making an effort. Then that has to kind of be what your argument is, and that has to kind of be what your thesis is. Um, so it's just very provisional, very messy. It sounded like you have a lot going on in your life right now, but you did some really interesting things here. Here's your grade. I think unfortunately this grad's going to go down because you don't have a peer draft, so it's probably going to be a C plus. But this is a totally valuable first draft. If you can find some time in your life to do a revision, I think that this could easily become an A essay if you just put in a little bit more effort. But you have some really interesting things here. We just have to make sure that you have main ideas, that we have transitions between paragraphs, that the developmental model makes sense about the order of the paragraphs. We need a much more specific thesis. We need a more specific introduction to introduce that thesis. And we just need more so what's at the end of the paragraph where you're kind of restating like this is the thing that I think is most important. But you're getting there. All right, talk to you soon.